It is often whispered that extreme grief can bend the mind and drive a person to commit the most bizarre of acts. Arthur Pendelton, a 38-year-old man carrying countless scars upon his soul, once believed that was merely a hollow saying. That was until he stepped into the model neighborhood of Maple Creek and witnessed firsthand the decaying madness hidden behind those perfectly manicured lawns. I am that man named Arthur, and I am telling this story from a strange apartment where the doors are always locked and I live in a state of constant, high alert at looking back to the day I first moved to Maple Creek to escape my past. It seemed like a beautiful sanctuary. The atmosphere was so perfect it felt overwhelming, populated by overly enthusiastic neighbors and a series of unspoken rules regarding cleanliness that everyone was expected to follow strictly. Amidst this artificially beautiful backdrop appeared Richard, the head of the neighborhood watch. He knocked on my door with an invitation to join their night patrol. When I accepted his offer, I did not foresee the thin line between protecting a community and the suffocating madness that would slowly strangle my own life. The first autumn in the falsely peaceful Maple Creek arrived with bone-chilling winds and a thick fog that clung to every corner of the smooth asphalt paths. The internal community message board, usually filled with trivial complaints about a neighbor's lawn or a dog barking at midnight, suddenly buzzed with talk of a strange and eerie phenomenon. Several neighbors claimed with certainty that they had seen an elderly woman in thin pajamas wandering aimlessly in the middle of the empty streets during the freezing weather. At first, I dismissed it as baseless gossip from idle people, until I witnessed the bizarre sight myself during a restless, sleepless night. As I stood idly by my bedroom window looking out into the dense darkness, I noticed a familiar figure moving slowly under the flickering yellow glow of a street lamp. It was Mrs. Margaret, a widow who lived a secluded life in a house just a few turns away from mine at the age of 85. It was unbelievable and haunting to see a frail, elderly woman with a trembling, punched gait struggling with all her remaining strength to push a massive metal supermarket cart. She moved through the streets with a heavy, rhythmic pace that was terrifyingly consistent. She followed the main road, turned at the intersection, and circled back to her starting point, repeating the cycle like a rusted machine programmed into unconsciousness. Curiosity mixed with a vague sense of unease prompted me to share this strange story with David, a single neighbor who suffered from severe insomnia and harbored a deep skepticism about everything around him. Contrary to my expectations, David did not mock me or brush it off. Instead, his dark-circled eyes lit up with a mix of high alert and a strange excitement. We made a bold decision to put on warm coats and secretly follow Mrs. Margaret on the following nights to discover what the senile woman was truly hiding beneath the cover of the fog. Those nights of stalking took place in a suffocating silence, broken only by the screeching sound of dry metal wheels grinding against the asphalt. Through the gray, hazy fog and the dim light scattered along the road, we strained our eyes from a safe distance. We were horrified to discover a detail straight out of a horror story. Inside that dilapidated, rusted cart were not groceries, scrap metal, or harmless household items as I had imagined. Instead, there was a very long, heavy wooden object of a truly bizarre shape. This dark wooden object was placed carefully, filling the entire cramped space of the cart. Its pointed end protruded past the edge of the basket, but because the nighttime fog was so thick and our vision was limited by the darkness, we could not discern the fine patterns or the true texture of that wooden block. In my heart, an unnamed chill began to rise along my spine, making the hair on my arms stand up. Yet, the logic of a man desperate to cling to normalcy stubbornly tried to reassure me and push away the fear. I swallowed the bitter saliva in my throat, turned to David, and whispered in a voice I tried to keep as calm as possible. I convinced myself that it was already early October. The season of masks and costumes was approaching, and I told myself that the strangely shaped wooden object must be nothing more than an oversized, expensive Halloween decoration. I imagined the poor, senile old woman was laboring to prepare it for her front lawn just to attract the attention of the neighborhood children. I kept repeating this weak reassurance in my head like a mantra to dispel the terrible premonition growing in my chest. I did so even as David stared with intense suspicion at the woman's bizarre, punched silhouette as she disappeared into the freezing sea of fog. My fragile reassurances were quickly crushed when the sky over Maple Creek began to pour down a relentless, morning rain that lasted for an entire week. The rain was not loud or hurried, but it fell persistently day and night, turning the entire environment into a world of gray, wet sadness. Despite the harsh, bone-chilling weather and the biting dampness, Mrs. Margaret maintained her strange nightly walk with the rickety supermarket cart and the giant wooden object inside. However, the cold raindrops and the slimy moisture began to erode the outer layer of what I had forced myself to believe was a harmless holiday decoration. That the dark plywood, soaked for too long, could no longer maintain its original shape. It began to peel, crack, and rot away in jagged patches, exposing discolored wood grain under the devastation of the weather. On a Wednesday night, as the wind howled through the trees, I threw on a raincoat to take out the trash and happened to be standing downwind just as the old woman pushed that rusted cart past the alleyway, a mere few steps from where I stood. A sudden burst of icy air swirled around the metal wheels, carrying a scent that struck my nostrils directly at the moment. My chest felt as if it were being squeezed, and my stomach churned with a sickening nausea from a foul, murky stench that was too disgusting for words. It was not the smell of ordinary dampness, stagnant household waste, or mold growing on rotting wood. It was the sweet, sickening, and horrific scent of flesh in an advanced state of decomposition. This thick, brutal odor of death surged into my brain, awakening my most primal survival instincts. An icy chill ran down my spine, my limbs trembled, and cold sweat drenched the back of my shirt despite the freezing air. That the fragmented pieces in my mind began to connect automatically, forming a picture of absolute horror that I never wanted to acknowledge. Even more terrifying was the bizarre reaction of those living around me. I knew for certain that I was not the only person in this neighborhood who saw that phantom figure or smelled the heavy, foul air emanating from that ghoulish cart. Yet, my civilized and polite neighbors, those diligent members of the neighborhood watch that Richard constantly praised, all chose to close their windows tight and pull their curtains shut. They turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to the abnormality right in front of them. That they preferred to live in a clean, perfect lie, pretending this neighborhood was still a flawless paradise, rather than bravely exposing the rotting truth gnawing at their home every night. Even David, the neighbor who once accompanied me, now chose to huddle inside his sealed house, refusing to open the door or discuss that strange woman any further. I was left alone, trapped in a circle of complicit silence and a horrific obsession that eroded my mind hour by hour. The decaying atmosphere in the night wind felt like a slow poison infecting my lungs, making it impossible to sleep for even an hour. The frantic suspicion and absolute terror had reached a breaking point where I could no longer tolerate any cowardly excuses. Standing on the wet asphalt under the pale light of the street lamp, I clenched my pale, trembling hands and told myself I could not continue to avoid reality. I could not hide in a shell of false safety while that dark truth tormented my mind for another second. I had to face it myself and strip it bare, no matter what earthly hell was contained within that rotting wooden object. That the sixth night finally arrived, bringing the bone-deep cold of autumn, and I knew I could not hesitate for another moment. When the haunting creak of the rusted wheels echoed from the end of the foggy street, I gathered what little courage remained in my pounding chest, stepped out of my house, and stood in the middle of the silent road. The rotting block of wood on the giant cart drew closer, emitting a thick, deathly stench, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself not to flee. Mrs. Margaret stopped when she saw me blocking her path. Her clouded, wrinkled eyes blinked in confusion and absolute terror. the eyes of a person whose mind was being slowly eaten away by time. Under the flickering yellow streetlights, I tried to keep my voice as soft and gentle as possible to reassure the poor woman. Tears began to leak from her deep sockets as she whimpered in a faint voice, telling me a story of tragic and painful love. She confessed that her husband had passed away many years ago, and she longed with a desperate madness to find his warmth again. She wanted to walk with him through their familiar neighborhood every night, just as they had during the beautiful days of their youth. In her tragic confusion, she believed that if she kept taking him for walks, he would hear her call and wake up, and his soul would return to her. Listening to the choked confessions of a widow trapped in the abyss of dementia, my heart felt squeezed by an indescribable pity. However, that compassion could not mask the brutal stench of death rising from the cart right next to us. I stepped back a few paces, my hands trembling as I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I dialed 911 and secretly whispered into the receiver, pleading with the operator to send help for an elderly woman with mental health issues. I begged them not to use sirens to avoid sending her into a fatal panic. But alas, the moment I turned my face away to whisper for help, a heavy, dull sound echoed behind me. It was the sound of rotting wood being torn apart, a noise that would forever be etched into my brain as a nightmare that could never be erased. That I spun around and felt the blood in my body freeze as I witnessed Mrs. Margaret wearing a radiant, proud smile. Her bony hands had just used all their strength to push open the lid of the decaying coffin. She wanted to show me her beloved husband, as if opening the box would prove their eternal love. But what lay motionless inside that rotting wood was the embodiment of hell on earth. The sickly yellow light of the lamp shone directly onto a corpse that was completely shriveled and decomposed to the point of deformity. The gray, wrinkled skin was peeling in patches, clinging to dark ribs, while the gaunt skull still held a few wisps of shaggy hair that draped over empty, black eye sockets. The rotting, tattered clothes were stuck to the foul, slimy fluid leaking from the remains, creating a scene of horror far beyond human imagination. The absolute terror hit my brain like a sledgehammer, leaving me completely paralyzed. I stood frozen, unable to move a finger or let out a single scream, even as my chest gasped for air. The twisted sight of an old woman smiling tenderly next to a rotting, decomposing corpse destroyed the thin boundaries of my reason. It turned that cold autumn night into a bleeding wound in my mind that would never heal. The time I spent staring at that corpse under the yellow light seemed to last an eternity, until flickering blue and red lights began to cut through the thick fog. Just as I had desperately requested, the police arrived in absolute silence, without any ear-splitting sirens that might shock the old woman's frail heart. The officers stepped out of their cars with expressions of extreme tension, quickly moving to cordoning off the scene. Others gently approached Mrs. Margaret to lead her away from the coffin reeking of death. The old woman went obediently as they draped a thin blanket over her shoulders. She sat in the back of the patrol car in total silence, her clouded eyes still fixed with lingering affection on the shriveled corpse, as if she had just been robbed of her life's most precious treasure. Soon after, a forensic team in full protective gear appeared, breaking the stillness of the night with the clatter of medical tools and bright yellow plastic tape. The commotion woke the entire Maple Creek neighborhood, forcing the cowardly neighbors to peek through their curtains and witness the disgusting truth they had tried to ignore for so long. When the black body bag was zipped shut and carried to the ambulance, a shocking secret was revealed that made my stomach churn once more. Through the investigation, it was discovered that the rotting corpse was indeed Mrs. Margaret's late husband, but the most terrifying part was that she had not done it alone. She had secretly hired an unknown person to dig up his grave 5 years ago. For 5 long years, that rotting coffin had been hidden inside the quiet house just a few turns from mine. No one in this supposedly model, secure neighborhood had the slightest clue that a corpse was decomposing right next to their own lawns day and night. That horrific event was like a cruel knife stabbing through the thin eardrums of my reason, causing my entire nervous system to collapse in a state of extreme panic. My body began to shake uncontrollably, my teeth chattered, and I vomited repeatedly until I collapsed on the cold pavement. The psychological shock was so great that I had to be hospitalized in a psychiatric ward for a short time to stabilize my heart rate and dispel the hallucinations of the deathly scent that haunted my sleep. Lying on that sterile white hospital bed, I realized that running away or closing my eyes like my neighbors would only turn me into weak prey, waiting to be swallowed by the madness lurking behind those white picket fences. When I was discharged and returned to Maple Creek, I made a decision that would completely change my life. I sought out Richard and officially added my name to the neighborhood watch. I did not do it out of some hollow sense of heroism or a desire to integrate into this fake community. I simply needed the legal authority to monitor every corner and protect myself from the sick, insane things that still lurked and waited to emerge from the deepest parts of the most seemingly perfect homes. Several months slowly passed since that horrific night. On the surface, Maple Creek seemed to have donned its usual coat of false peace, but deep within my mind, everything had forever changed. Officially wearing the reflective vest of the neighborhood watch did not bring the sense of security I had hoped for. Instead, it turned my chronic insomnia into high-tension patrols, where I spent hours scrutinizing every tree and blade of grass. The simmering anxiety of the community soon found a new target when everyone woke up one morning to find an old, dilapidated car parked in a quiet, empty lot at the bend of a dead-end alley. It was an ancient, crumbling machine with peeling paint that revealed rusted patches as red as dried blood. All four tires were flat and seemed to have taken root in the mud, and the windows were so grimy and opaque that it was impossible to see the interior. No one in the neighborhood knew who the owner was or how it had been towed there in the middle of the night without the sound of an engine alerting the watchful ears of the patrol. Based on its ghostly appearance and the eerie atmosphere the hunk of metal emitted, they began calling it Pristine, after the classic horror novel about a haunted car. The mysterious appearance of Pristine felt like a dark omen, marking the start of a series of persistent and senseless acts of vandalism against the expensive, polished cars parked along the curbs of Maple Creek. Nearly every morning, one or more neighbors would scream in horror upon finding their beloved vehicles scratched with deep, long gouges or, worse, with side mirrors snapped and hanging pathetically. The boldness of this hidden vandal felt like a slap to the pride of the neighborhood watch, forcing Richard to call emergency meetings and double the night patrol. As a new member desperate for control, I volunteered for the most difficult pre-dawn shifts, walking the silent streets with a flashlight in hand. Yet, no matter how thick our net was or how we stationed ourselves at the most strategic hidden corners, the culprit evaporated like a ghost. They left behind fresh scratches on car hoods as if to mock the helplessness of everyone involved. Night after night, physical exhaustion blended with mental obsession. My patrol steps would unconsciously lead me toward the empty lot where the car Pristine lay silent in the darkness like an abandoned grave. Each time I stood a short distance from that rusted machine, I felt an icy draft run down my spine and the hair on my arms would stand up, exactly like the feeling I had standing before the old woman's rotting coffin years ago. Although the car windows were murky and black as ink, I had a powerful, skin-crawling premonition that from deep within that cramped, moldy cabin, an invisible, cold pair of eyes was watching my every move. They seemed to be peering through the decaying metal to observe the pathetic state of those who called themselves the protectors of the neighborhood. The feeling of being watched clung to me persistently. On many nights, I squeezed the handle of my flashlight so hard my palms nearly bled, and I bit my lip to stop myself from rushing forward to smash the glass to see if some distorted thing was sheltering inside. The dark shadow of Christine cast upon the ground under the flickering streetlights seemed to grow longer each day, looming over my mind and draining what little courage I had left. It whispered wordless threats into my ear about a terrible calamity waiting to swallow us all. The lingering helplessness of failing to find the vandal and the vague obsession with the invisible eyes from the rusted Christine had not yet released my mind when a new threat arrived. This one was far more destructive and direct. It was late one afternoon, when the last rays of the day had been swallowed by the gathering dusk. I was dragging my exhausted feet along the sidewalk after a grueling day's shift when I happened to encounter three strangers who did not belong to the model neighborhood of Maple Creek. That they were two men and a woman dressed in filthy clothes, reeking of alcohol, and staggering with an incredibly arrogant attitude. Their wild laughter and vulgar curses tore through the falsely peaceful air, and I tried to slow my pace and huddle against the edge of a fence to avoid their attention. But the nightmare did not stem from their crude words. It came from a cruel, destructive act performed with a bone-chilling indifference. As they passed a house on the corner of the intersection, one of the men grinned and casually flicked a lit cigarette into the thick bushes of a neighbor's yard. The dry weather of the past several weeks had turned the once green leaves into a highly flammable tinder. Within just a few heartbeats, a frantic fire erupted, licking the dry branches with terrifying speed. The crackling sound of heated wood mixed with the mocking laughter of the three wanderers as they casually turned their backs and disappeared into the night. They left the flames to grow and destroy everything in their path. Shock kept me frozen for a moment before I snapped into action, screaming in alarm and banging on the owner's door. Thick columns of black smoke began to curl upward, obscuring the twilight sky, while the intense heat from the sea of fire slapped against my face. Although I called for an emergency fire response, the slow and delayed arrival of the firefighters exposed a cruel and harsh truth. All the efforts of the neighborhood watch were merely a fragile, useless joke in the face of the fire's brutal power. By the time the sirens wailed and high-pressure hoses began to spray, the entire wooden fence and the lush old trees in the front yard had been completely incinerated, leaving only charred, smoking trunks. Standing there staring at the ashes drifting in the air and sticking to my clothes and hair, I felt a primal, deep-seated fear take root in my chest. The ghostly light of the fire was etched into my eyes, and it had burned not only the perfect landscape of Maple Creek but also the last bit of false security I had clung to. The cruelty of those wanderers, the terrifying indifference of my own kind, and the unfathomable power of the fire merged together to create a deep-seated phobia of fire within me. I began to see ghost lights dancing in the darkness in every corner of this rotting neighborhood. This obsession with ghost lights felt like a cursed infection in my mind, only to break out into a real nightmare one quiet, late weekend night. I was sitting in the corner of my dark room, sweating from a cold chill, when a thunderous explosion tore through the black velvet of the night. The violent sound was strong enough to shake the glass panes of my house and awaken every sense already on high alert. My chest tightened as I rushed to the window to look toward the empty lot where the ghostly car Christine had sat silent. At the scene that met my eyes was so gruesome it felt as if my heart stopped for a few seconds. The entire cramped interior of that rusted car was now a blazing furnace, lighting up a corner of the sky. Bright red tongues of fire licked through the shattered glass, dancing wildly as they consumed the rotting interior. But the nightmare did not end with the self-destruction of a piece of scrap metal. Aggressive sparks, carried by the night wind, began to fly toward the surrounding area. Worst of all, they quickly ignited the dry wooden walls of a shed owned by the neighbor living right next to the lot. That shed, which was always kept locked, had unknowingly become a ticking time bomb. Its owner had been secretly storing countless containers of flammable chemicals and numerous compressed air canisters inside. In the blink of an eye, the fire grew from a small flame into a giant, growling monster, swallowing the shed's loose structure. It emitted a series of continuous popping and banging sounds as the heat built up inside the pressure vessels. The sound of tearing metal and the high-pitched hiss of escaping air created a deathly symphony that pushed my panic to its peak. The horrific memory of the fire department's delay during the fence fire came rushing back like an electric shock. Without a second thought, I kicked open my front door and ran out into the streets filled with acrid smoke. Ignoring the heat slapping my skin and the chemical stench damaging my lungs, I ran frantically down the street, banging on every door and screaming until my voice was hoarse to wake the sleeping families. My hands hit those white-painted wooden doors until they were bloodied. The sounds of children screaming, dogs barking, and adults calling out in panic created a chaotic and deafening noise. The model neighborhood of Maple Creek, which once boasted of its perfect peace, had completely collapsed. It turned into a horrific scene of a miniature battlefield, choked with smoke, fire, and screams. Figures in pajamas rushed into the street, their faces etched with terror as they witnessed the giant pillar of fire staining the night sky red. It threatened to incinerate every nearby home, turning the fragile efforts of the neighborhood watch into meaningless dust before the fury of the demonic fire. Amidst the chaos, a horrific thought suddenly surrounded my mind: someone might still be trapped inside the house right next to the burning shed. Despite the fire growling like a bloodthirsty beast and the incredible heat, I gritted my teeth and risked my life. I ran through the smoke-filled front yard, approaching the edge of the danger zone to search for any sign of life. The heat surrounded me like an invisible monster, melting every pore, and the air became thick with acrid chemicals, draining the thin oxygen from my lungs. My vision was blurred by the billowing black smoke, but my legs stubbornly took another step toward the glowing, collapsing wooden wall. At that life-or-death moment, a deafening sound erupted from the core of the shed, like a roar of fury from a demon rising from the depths of hell. All the air canisters and chemical drums had reached their limit and exploded simultaneously, creating a massive pressure that tore through everything in its path. A giant wall of rolling fire, carrying the heat to incinerate all things, suddenly surged toward me at an unavoidable speed. Driven by a primal survival instinct, I immediately threw myself backward and took a desperate leap toward the grass. I fell just as the cruel tongue of fire slapped the space where I had been standing. The incredible heat licked across my face, incinerating part of my hair and shaving off my eyebrows in a single heartbeat. It left a burning sensation that reached into my bones, like thousands of needles stabbing my skin. I lay on the wet grass, my chest heaving, gasping for air in broken breaths. I realized that if I had been even 1,000th of a second slower, my entire body would have been swallowed by that hellish wall and turned to ash. Soon after, the piercing sirens of fire trucks and police cars wailed in unison, breaking the fire's dominance with pillars of cold, high-pressure water. When the ashes finally settled and a gray dawn began to reveal a charred and ruined battlefield, investigators from the fire department arrived. Their findings made my chest tighten even more. They discovered a small, secret hole drilled into the glass of the car named pristine, along with clear traces of an accelerant that had been intentionally poured inside. This was not an accident, it was an act of sophisticated and cruel arson. The hidden villain had calculated every step, turning the car into a ticking time bomb to trigger a chain of destruction. Yet, despite the police's efforts to investigate and cordoning off the scene, the culprit seemed to have evaporated into the night without leaving a single fingerprint or a muddy footprint. The fact that the arsonist could escape without a trace in a neighborhood so heavily guarded by the neighborhood watch struck a fatal blow to my remaining sense of security. My obsession with fire grew from a simple fear into a severe psychological illness that took root in my nerves, draining my life. Since that night, I break into a cold sweat and tremble every time I catch a faint scent of smoke in the wind or see a small spark. I know the real devil is still out there, waiting to incinerate my life once more. The following summer brought a stifling and oppressive heat that covered Maple Creek like an invisible shroud, imprisoning souls that were already fraying. The heat reflecting off the sun-baked asphalt could not dispel the chill that lurked behind the windows of these model homes. The internal message board, which had been awkwardly silent since the fire, suddenly erupted with a report that sounded utterly ridiculous. It came from two elderly women living at the end of the tree-lined road. They insisted with panicked certainty that they had seen a giant homeless man walking a crocodile along the sidewalk in the misty dawn. Amidst this tension and skepticism, Richard and the arrogant core members of the neighborhood watch simply laughed and dismissed the information as worthless. They mocked it as a fairy tale born from the wild imagination and fading eyesight of the elderly. They argued that it was impossible for a dangerous, bloodthirsty reptile to be walking through a suburb thousands of miles from its natural marshlands. Richard's blind arrogance made him believe that Maple Creek was still an impregnable fortress under his leadership. He believed the patrol only needed to worry about car vandals and petty thieves. However, for someone who had seen a shriveled corpse in a rotting coffin and was nearly incinerated by a wall of fire, their mockery sounded foolish and dangerous. My intuition, scarred by trauma, told me that in a place like Maple Creek, nothing was impossible. The dismissiveness of my neighbors did not put me at ease. Instead, it deepened my anxiety, making my stomach knot and preventing me from sleeping. The fear, mixed with the trauma of the fire, drove me to distance myself from the hollow protection of the neighborhood watch. Instead of trying to sleep, I began to imprison myself in sleepless nights, drinking black coffee to keep my bloodshot eyes fixed on the dark living room window. I decided to take on the duty of guarding my own home, straining every nerve to hear the smallest sound amidst the summer cicadas. My hand stayed close to the door lock as I scanned the silent street with a high determination. I was determined not to let any threat, be it a sick murderer, an arsonist, or a scaly monster, approach and tear away the last bit of peace I was desperately clinging to on the edge of madness. Those sleepless nights drained my remaining strength, turning my small living room into a suffocating cage. When the grandfather clock on the wall slowly struck 1 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of the house became so oppressive I felt like I couldn't breathe. The biting anxiety and persistent insomnia pushed me to a reckless decision. I put on my running shoes and stepped outside to run, hoping to escape the feeling of suffocation. Tonight, the full moon hung directly overhead, casting a cold, silver light that clearly illuminated every corner of the silent Maple Creek. A rare night breeze passed through, carrying a bit of damp mist, but it wasn't enough to dispel the summer's weight. I ran along the empty asphalt, my heartbeat sinking with the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement. I falsely believed that physical exertion would help my weary brain forget the horrific visions. But as I rounded the bend under the largest old tree in the neighborhood, my steps suddenly stopped as if they were nailed to the ground. My blood froze at the sight before me. Under the moonlight as bright as day, the nightmare from the old woman's stories had manifested in the flesh. Standing in the middle of the road was Goliath, a homeless man with a giant frame over 2 meters tall. His massive body blocked out a section of light. His hair and beard were so thick and matted they obscured his face, making him look like a mysterious creature from prehistory. He wore a filthy, tattered black cloak that dragged along the asphalt with each step, making him look like a giant ghost drifting through the night. But the terror that made my breath stop did not come from the giant man, it came from the creature crawling at his heels. Bound by a long, clinking metal chain was Princess, a real American alligator of a threatening size, slowly dragging its heavy belly over the asphalt. The creature's dark, scaly skin shimmered with a sickly, ghostly light under the street lamps and the silver moon. It created a truly bizarre and hair-raising image in a suburb once considered perfectly safe. The screeching sound of sharp claws on the road and the thud of its heavy tail echoed in the silence. It was a deathly melody that destroyed all my efforts to deny reality. That the silence was horrifying, with no crickets or wind, only the presence of the dark giant and the man-eating predator. They walked as if they were phantoms returning from the underworld, trampling over the pride of the neighborhood watch. My chest tightened, and I kept my eyes wide, not daring to blink. I pressed my trembling body into the shadow of the old tree, praying that my small presence would not be noticed by the wild eyes of that bizarre pair. That the stillness was suddenly torn apart by a deep, trembling growl from the creature named Princess. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard on a nature program. It was a low, threatening roar from deep within its chest, like an ancient dragon waking from the dead. The sound vibrated through the pavement and into my eardrums, making every nerve feel like it would shatter. In a moment of weakness, I let out a sharp gasp of fear. Goliath's keen hearing immediately caught the frequency of my presence. That the giant man stopped and slowly turned his shaggy head toward the tree where I was trying to make myself as thin as paper. His wild, sharp eyes glowed under the full moon, piercing the darkness to find me with cruel accuracy. Realizing he had found his prey, he did not seem panicked. Instead, he let out a savage smirk and began taking heavy, threatening steps toward the tree. The thick metal chain in his hand jerked once, and in a raspy, deep voice that sounded like rusted iron, he hissed out deathly commands to the alligator to prepare for an attack. Princess opened its long maw, filled with white, pointed teeth, and let out a threatening hiss while its armored tail whipped the ground. In that moment of suffocation, as my heart hammered against my ribs, I knew I couldn't just stand there and wait for death. My sweaty, trembling hand reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone with the most cautious movements I could manage. I bypassed the call function, knowing that any voice or ringtone would trigger the predator's instinct. Instead, I used a shaking thumb to frantically type a text to 911, reporting a mad giant and a reptile monster about to tear someone apart. At the moment I pressed send, Goliath let out a piercing roar, signaling the monster to lunge forward. Without waiting another second, I used every ounce of survival instinct in my muscles to spin around and run for my life. My panicked footsteps echoed in the night air, mixed with the sound of claws tearing at the pavement right behind me. It was a horrific symphony that drove me forward as I prayed that the darkness would hide me before those jaws could bite through my skin. That I exhausted my last bit of strength to reach my porch, fumbling with the metal key as the sound of claws seemed to be right at my heels. The moment the door opened, I dove inside and used my whole weight to slam it shut and lock every bolt. I slid down to the cold floor, gasping for air like someone who had just returned from the dead. At that same moment, the screeching sounds of sirens filled the night as the police and animal control surrounded the block with flashing red and blue lights. That when my heart had slowed and my breathing was less frantic, I took the courage to peek through a corner of the curtain. I was shocked to see a scene completely different from the horror of just a few minutes ago. Under the bright searchlights, Goliath did not resist or roar like a cornered beast. Instead, he slowly knelt onto the rough asphalt. His large, rough hand, which had held the deathly chain, now gently stroked the scales on the alligator's back. He soothed her with warm whispers so that the rescue workers could easily place the creature into a steel cage. The alligator did not thrash or perform any deathly roles. She followed her owner's touch like a loyal pet. When the heavy cage door shut, the tattered giant stood up and silently offered his wrists to the police for the handcuffs. He walked to the patrol car with a silent, heavy resignation. Seeing that large frame hunched over to fit into the cramped car, being stripped of the only thing he had, my heart suddenly ached. I felt a mix of relief for my own life and a deep, choking sadness. Through later information leaked from the police, I learned that the demon under the full moon was actually a lonely man named Warren. He had found and raised the alligator since it was tiny, and it had become his only companion in a cold, cruel world. He had no intention of raising a killing machine or sowing terror. He was simply trying to protect and love a creature as wretched and abandoned as himself. That night's events struck a blow to my own prejudices, leaving me with a profound confusion about the thin line between pure evil and the pitiful despair of those pushed to the margins of society. The image of the giant crying as he touched the black scales of his friend would forever haunt me as a bitter reminder. Sometimes the most grotesque forms hide the purest feelings, while the truly invisible evil often hides behind perfect, civilized veneers, and the polite smiles of neighbors. The collapse of my perception after witnessing the giant and his alligator left a gaping hole in my mind. I realized I was pathetically alone in this flashy but hollow neighborhood. The cold loneliness and the stress that threatened to choke me forced me to seek a spiritual anchor. That was when I invited Marcus, a close friend from university with Middle Eastern roots, to move in with me. Initially, I thought Marcus' presence would bring warmth and laughter to dispel the gloom. Instead, it became a cruel catalyst that tore the last mask of civility from the neighborhood watch. From the very first day Marcus began carrying his belongings over my threshold, the attitude of the neighbors shifted with a terrifying speed. The cheerful waves and bright smiles at the mailbox evaporated. The trays of freshly baked cookies were gone. In their place were cold, scrutinizing stares filled with hostility and contempt, thrown from behind curtains whenever we stepped outside. This disgusting prejudice did not explode into loud arguments or vulgar insults. It was an oily, subtle, and sophisticated malice, the way supposedly civilized upper-class people corner their prey. Things truly worsened when anonymous, typed letters began appearing in my mailbox. At first, they were bossy reminders about weeds growing onto the path or a car parked slightly over the line, even though my yard was perfectly tidy. But within weeks, the letters escalated into insane and baseless accusations. They claimed Marcus and I were operating a secret methamphetamine lab in my basement. The madness of this lie was that my ranch-style house did not even have a basement. The anonymous writer didn't even bother to learn the house's structure. They just wanted to project their filthiest prejudices onto us, using racial slurs against Marcus to destroy his dignity. Looking at those crisp white papers and the dark, judgmental ink, I realized a terrifying truth. The neighborhood watch under Richard was not created to protect anyone from crime. It was a secret, extremist cult using security as a cover to brainwash residents into maintaining a bizarre version of purity. These devils in the guise of honest citizens were willing to use the most cowardly threats to drive away anyone who was culturally different or refused to bow to their unwritten laws. The organization nurtured cold-blooded people behind white picket fences, and they had officially targeted us, turning our sanctuary into a suffocating battle for survival. The tension from the letters regarding the drug lab did not fade. It grew heavier every day. Maple Creek had finally dropped its friendly mask to reveal its true face as a dark prison. Every move Marcus and I made was monitored by malicious eyes. The most prominent among those who gave themselves the right to judge us was Old Man Vance. He was a wrinkled, hateful man and one of the most extremist members of the watch. He made no effort to hide his hostility, turning the sidewalk in front of my house into his personal guard post. That some nights, I would wake up and peek through the curtains only to feel my blood run cold. Vance's thin silhouette would be standing under the yellow streetlight, staring at the house like a ghost carrying an omen of death. He said nothing and made no move, but his silent, persistent presence felt like a mountain of stone crushing my nerves. His sick patience was like an invisible noose slowly tightening around our throats. And then, the worst thing I feared finally happened on a quiet, hot night that I was jolted from a restless sleep by a horrific smell that was already etched into my mind: the acrid scent of burning wood and thick smoke. The memory of the fire at the warehouse years ago surged back, and I rushed to the front door like a madman. Through the glass, I saw my entire front fence engulfed in a sea of red flames. The tongues of fire licked the dry wood, crackling as if they were celebrating a victory over our weakness. Panic exploded in my chest as I screamed for Marcus. We grabbed every water container we could find and rushed outside to stop the fire before it reached the house. Amidst the smoke and heat, my phobia of fire was triggered so violently my body felt limp, and I couldn't even scream for help clearly. The fire department arrived in time to control the blaze, but what truly froze my blood was not the charred remains. It was a small object placed carefully on the stone steps of the porch, untouched by the fire. It was a neatly folded piece of paper with the Neighborhood Watch logo. Inside, a single typed line in cold black ink stated that the cleansing fire would burn the heathens. That direct and unmasked threat was like a knife to my heart. It tore away any hope of a peaceful resolution. Standing there in the acrid smell of my own home, Marcus and I looked at each other with absolute despair. We understood the phantasmagoric truth: we were trapped with a pack of beasts disguised as citizens, who wanted to use fire to burn away anything that did not fit their sick standards. Rage boiled over in my veins, incinerating the last of my fear. I could not stand by and watch my best friend and myself be pushed to the end. I crumpled that deathly note in my hand and, with Marcus, I marched out of the yard filled with ash. We walked with heavy steps toward the grandest house in the center of the neighborhood, where Richard, the leader of this secret cult, sat in comfort. Despite the early hour, I pounded on his solid oak door with a determination that had nothing left to lose. In contrast to our fury, the door opened slowly to reveal Richard's calm, emotionless face and a faint smirk. He was wearing a silk robe and acted with an eerie politeness, inviting us into his luxurious living room and even pouring tea as if this were a well-rehearsed play. I ignored the tea and slammed the crumpled note onto the table. In a choked growl, I exposed every cowardly crime from the anonymous letters to the arson meant to purge the different ones. Richard leaned back, sipped his tea, and sighed with a practiced look of fake sympathy, but his eyes were as cold as a reptile's venom. The fire in his fireplace danced in those dark eyes, making my phobia flare up, but I gritted my teeth and stood my ground. In a smooth, oily voice, he denied everything, blaming isolated extremists for trying to ruin the neighborhood's reputation. Yet every word he spoke carried a hidden, razor-sharp threat. He looked at Marcus and then at me, advising us in a terrifyingly fatherly tone. He whispered that Maple Creek was a community built on traditional standards and that new elements sometimes agitated the peaceful residents. With a cold, gentle smile, Richard suggested we consider our own safety before these small cracks became an irreversible tragedy. He suggested that the wide world surely had more tolerant places for people of our free-thinking nature. He even added a cruel compliment about my resilience in surviving the recent fires, a blunt reminder that he knew my every weakness. That warning, a death sentence wrapped in hypocritical concern, ended all hope for dialogue. I realized I was not facing a conservative neighbor, but a true invisible monster giving us an ultimatum: leave his territory or be turned into ash by their cleansing fire. 3 days after that meeting passed like a century of paranoia and terror. Marcus and I barely slept, taking turns watching the windows with crude weapons in hand, waiting for the fire or an attack. However, instead of a bloody confrontation, the neighborhood was shaken by a different news report on the morning of the 4th day. Old Man Vance, the extremist who had guarded our sidewalk, had died suddenly in his own home. The cause was quickly ruled as a heart attack during the night, with no signs of struggle. Immediately after his death, a bone-chilling phenomenon occurred: the letters in our mailbox vanished completely, not leaving a scrap behind. Even more terrifying was that everyone, including Richard, suddenly turned 180 degrees. Their cold hostility was replaced by a fake, sickening kindness. They gathered on their porches to wave at us and even brought baked goods and fruit to our door with sweet inquiries about our health. Holding a tray filled with the scent of lies, I watched Richard standing among the neighbors, faking a tear. For Vance, a cold chill rose from the earth and settled in my spine. I connected his words from our confrontation and realized a dark truth. Vance's death was no coincidence. It was a cold-blooded execution disguised as a medical accident, arranged by Richard. The leader understood that Vance's out-of-control extremism was attracting too much attention and threatening his pure order. To clean up the mess and maintain his power, he had discarded his most loyal follower, using the death as a silent message to us that the fake kindness and the pastries were their way of smoothing over a heinous crime, proving that this neighborhood watch was a machine that crushed humanity. It would swallow anyone who threatened its rotting perfection. A feeling of suffocation washed over me as I realized I was living with a pack of invisible devils, murderers in aprons who mowed their lawns on the weekends. The kindness of Richard and the neighbors was a mental shackle. We realized the real devil was not the corpse in the coffin or the alligator under the moon, but the people smiling politely in the sun. That we understood that the peace of Maple Creek was built on the purging of the defiant. Without a moment's delay, we sold the house at a loss and packed our things, leaving that living hell in the middle of the night without a word of goodbye. Now, sitting in a small apartment in busy San Francisco with 2 deadbolts on the door, I still jump at strange noises or the scent of smoke. That trauma has changed my life forever. I will never join a community group again, because I know that behind those perfectly trimmed lawns, there are souls that have been rotting for a long time. This story ends with a lesson: never judge a person by a flashy exterior and always stay alert to extremist control disguised as safety. True humanity lies in compassion for the weak, not in blind obedience to soulless laws. Thank you for listening to my haunting journey on our channel. If you are moved by this story, please give us a subscription, a like, and share this video. Tell us what you think of these events and if they relate to anything in your own life in the comments. I wish you all good health, a happy life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.